Good evening and welcome to this video in which we are going to talk about the situation around Israel. Tonight, we will again focus on geopolitics, international relations, and the technological dimension. What are the military capabilities of both sides? Israel, with its well-known arsenal, primarily consists of American-made planes and missiles. They have a lot of defense systems as well. And against them, there's Iran, which has an army that is incapable of operating, which is completely outdated today, which has not modernized for decades, but which has developed an unconventional arsenal, especially around ballistic missiles, which have a terrorist capability and with which they are powerful, since they also have all their proxies, whether it's tools, Hezbollah, etc., who are very engaged in the region. So just for a little feedback, by the way, first question, because you all hear me, well, first a little feedback on the incredible success of Israel since a few weeks. Now, it's not been very long, but they have still accumulated strategic successes that are the culmination of years and years of efforts, whether it's intelligence or the implementation of different means. But for example, you have it started with this story of the famous pagers. So it should be known that for several months we have had regular bombings of Hezbollah on Israel. You remember that there were 11 deaths, less than 11 children who were killed on the Golan Heights by a ballistic missile bombing that fell on a football field while they were training. So there are regularly missiles that are coming in. You have tens of thousands of Israelis who had to leave the north of the country because they were nearby and within range of Hezbollah's missiles. So there was already this tension and this situation in which the Israeli population was also asking to be able to return to where they lived, to their place of residence. So there was already this tension. What happened is that Hezbollah for years and years has been infiltrated by Israel, and especially since Israel made it known that they were infiltrated, and in particular that their mobile phone was being tapped. What did they do? There were two consequences. The first is that Iran has set up a landline network parallel to the Lebanese network. That is, when you call with the landline network, there are cables. The Israelis had gotten on them. When you use your mobile phone, the Israelis were listening. So ultimately, this secondary landline network funded by Iran was a way to avoid being listened to. So to know that you need to call someone back, logically, that's why there were pagers. And from the information we have now, it's been over 2 years since Israel created this pager company that actually sells these little pager systems that are sent here and there, which they have actually sold to customers. And it was a dummy company whose sole long-term goal was to sell these hacked pages with expeditions to Hezbollah. So Israel instilled this idea that it would be good to switch to a terrestrial network of crazy size, because afterwards it has really been years that it has been preparing this operation. The stroke of genius is that thousands of Hezbollah executives with the pager in their pocket are going to explode simultaneously. You have thousands of injured, you have several hundred, almost 800, who are blind today because they looked at the short message service with the phone number they had to call back. And that means that a huge proportion of Hezbollah executives are today unable to carry out their normal mission, which is a parallel army. Again, we must not forget that Hezbollah is an Iranian army in Lebanon. And that's why when you have Israeli successes against Hezbollah, you also have the others, let's say the minorities, because no one represents the majority in a country that is confessional in Lebanon. You have the Christians who represent maybe 40% of the population. It doesn't bother them that we hit Hezbollah again because they are tired of being enslaved by Iran. And you have the Sunni minorities, so the Muslims rather, let's say, like those who are from Saudi Arabia, who are also happy. And that's why in the second phase of this offensive, there was the story of the pages, there was the story of the walkie-talkies, there were apparently scales, there were solar panels. So there were a lot of things that were trapped, and it really helped to undermine the system. There was this massive bombing against Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Iran. So you have a lot of leaders who were killed. There is really a situation on which there is a turnover at the top level of Hezbollah. It's worse than at McDonald's. There are people who get fired as they go along. 2 weeks later, there is a new one. It doesn't stop filling up. So leaders will always come. But But you have to understand that at some point you have the historical leaders who are no longer there. The people who provoked the attacks against the French. We must not forget that Hezbollah is a terrorist group that organized attacks, obviously in Lebanon with the Drakkar attacks. They organized attacks in France during the Christmas period on department stores. It's a terrorist group against which France is not enough at war. But in any case, we are rather satisfied that Israel does the job of killing the people who killed French people at that time. And so that's why when Israel succeeded in its various coups, we were rather satisfied. When they managed to kill Hassan Nasrallah, he is the leader of a terrorist group, we are satisfied. But you have scenes of jubilation in the Arab world. You have scenes of jubilation in Syria. You have scenes of jubilation in Lebanon among the Sunni minorities and among the Christian minorities. So that's why today we are in a situation that is a little bit complicated, because it's a mess in these countries. You have communities that hate each other and live next to each other. And the only ones who were happy with the real presence of Hezbollah, it was the Shiites, because it gives them a lot of work, because it's Iran who pays behind. The investigation really very thorough. Hezbollah is financed on the one hand by Iran and on the other hand by international drug trafficking with ramifications in South America, Asia, the outlet being mainly Europe and the United States. They destroy the Westerners, they finance their war, so that's all benefit for them. And so we come to this situation where there are obviously responses from Hezbollah to the death of Nasrallah. There is Israel, who you may have also seen after they killed Nasrallah, they continued their bombing operations, particularly on stocks, on ammunition depots. And I was on the set of Lashain Info the other night when it was happening live, meaning that Itwina will be there. It happens in the afternoon. There is not yet confirmation, and they announce attention in the half hour to come evacuate these three zones at 543.744 yards around, because these are Hezbollah's ammunition stock depots, which obviously hide under buildings, under houses, under mosques, and that we are going to destroy. You have half an hour to evacuate the area. And that's why there were scenes of people fleeing at that time, because Hezbollah, once again, like all terrorist groups, uses the method of the human shield. And Israel, when they struck these different sites, we clearly saw, of course, that there were secondary explosions, which was clear proof that these were storage sites. As for the purely technical dimension of these different bombings, bombed in a site where there are ammunition depots that are outside, well, then Hezbollah is smarter than Russia. Russia leaves their mission stop in the open air. It's good that a small drone makes everything explode. You have seen several tens of thousands of shells, 30,000 tons of shells apparently exploded, for example, in Defer 2 weeks ago in Russia by a simple little Ukrainian drone that fell on it. Hezbollah could not afford to do that because obviously Israel would have responded immediately. So it was buried. Nasrallah's bunker was also very deeply buried. So what do the Israelis do in the face of such a situation and all the countries of the world? We developed from the 70s, 80s bombs that we call bunker busters. That is, when you go with your plane, you want at very high altitude, and you have bombs with a guidance system that is much more effective than what we had in the past. I'll give you an example. For instance, during the Gulf War in the 90s, the United States had already integrated these gliding precise bombs, which allowed them to get to 0 miles altitude, let their bombs fall a few tens of kilometers, staying very high, therefore out of reach of the Iraqi air defense system that they would have detected anyway, with countermeasure systems. And so they dropped their bombs. These bombs, they have a capacity through the integrated global positioning system to go strike directly at the target, while we, the French, when we went there, when we had our Mirage phone or Jaguar, we were at very low altitude, a little bit like the Russians did during the war in Ukraine. Since we didn't have a guidance system and the Russians didn't have one at the beginning of the war, we had to fly so low that the enemy air defense, when they saw us, they didn't have time to get their cannon out. And it allowed us to pass under the air defense. And that's why we lost planes. Go to the Air and Space Museum, you will see that it's a Jaguar that was impacted, which was able to land because it took a hit from an anti-aircraft machine gun. So there was already this difference. The Americans had very deep penetration systems since the 80s, and we arrived much later. So today it's normal to have this type of bomb with a high penetration rate. To put it simply, that is to say that compared to a classic bomb, for example, a joint direct attack munition. You know that the joint direct attack munition is a bomb kit that we will add to a smooth bomb. So a smooth bomb, it's simply a normal explosive bomb. And the joint direct attack munition kit, it's going to be little wings that will fly. And at the front, there are heads that will allow to have different functions. There are heads that will correspond to the guidance we want. Do we want laser guidance? In which case my bomb will follow a lighting with the laser. You have guidance that can be global positioning system. You also have millimetric stuff. You also have cameras. So we have different types of guidance that are possible. But the bomb, especially when we want to target a bunker, it will be reinforced. That is to say that the front of the bomb is much stronger than what we will have with a bomb that simply has to explode on impact. So when the normal bomb arrives on its target, whether it's a building or a tank, it's going to explode. But a bunker buster, that's the generic name. It's going to have the ability to penetrate several meters of concrete and explode either with a timer, that is to say a few tenths of a second later, when it has penetrated, 16 feet, 4 inches deep, either on the most effective bombs or missiles as well. It's the same system, either with, it's going to count either by gravity. They're going to have energetic centers that are going to say, there, you've sunk 13 feet and a half, that's good, that's where you have to blow up. Or it's going to be able to count the number of floors. If you have, a parking lot, and that's under the parking lot, that's the bunker, it's going to count that there are 3 floors of parking, and that it's on the 4th floor that it has to explode. So we have systems like that, which are super, super efficient. And the other possibility, that I was a mission planner on fighter planes, on Gusts. I prepared the missions at the 12F, the Fleet 12F, that is to say that we configured the French bombs and ATWASM, which was integrated on the Gust. And these bombs do exactly the same thing, but we also have the possibility of having bombs whose trajectory we will configure. For example, my plane is here, my target is here, and I want, for example, that my bomb arrives well vertically, and we can configure the trajectory of the bomb, and from my plane will enter a space which is roughly, it's a kind of zone in the sky. From where the plane will enter this zone, it turns, even if it's not facing its target, the bomb, it will go all alone to the right place. And if it drops 2 or 3 or 4 bombs, that depends on the mass of the bombs that we will choose, but we could choose several at the same time. They will all reflect to arrive at, with a fraction of a second difference. The first one digs a hole, the second one digs a second hole, and it goes like that, sinking to be able to strike in a very, very great depth. And so we have bunker busters, and we also have a possibility to accumulate bombs to go deeper and deeper. And if the bunker is 98 feet deep, obviously we need to use several bombs that will each enter the same hole. And when the French tested the first ATWASM at the Landis test center, when they were tested, well, it was so precise that the 2 bombs had entered the same hole, and they said, past the second one, well, the second one had really entered exactly the same hole. Just a small point for efficiency and refinement. You should know that, for example, I told you earlier, if I drop my bomb here and my target is there, I can arrive at this angle. I can choose to have this angle, but I can also choose to come back behind and bomb at this angle so that any debris are projected on this side. For example, if I have a school here like this, I will have debris that will not touch, that will not impact my school. You have to imagine that this system is so precise that, for example, during the war in Libya, we had non-explosive bombs. That is to say, when you drop a training bomb that weighs hundreds of kilograms, that you are at 10,0 miles altitude, that it will arrive at 497 miles on a tank, it does not need to explode. And so in the city, we could destroy Gaddafi's tanks at the time. I'm not talking about the interest and legitimacy of carrying out this operation, but in any case, technologically, we are so precise that we are capable of making non-explosive ammunition. And it's 1,000 miles, obviously, from what we see on the Russian side, because without interesting precision, they are forced to use bombs that carry up to 2 tons, 3 tons of explosives. Finally, it's not all explosives. These are 3-ton bombs. So logically, the low precision of the bombs is compensated by a large amount of explosives. All this to tell you that they managed to hit Nasrallah. It was an additional success on a long list of successes, and they continued to strike what I anticipated as being a possible preparation for a future ground offensive, ground incursions. But traditionally, when an army is preparing to engage ground troops, it prepares for days and days with dozens and dozens of bombings on defense sites, on bunkers, etc. And then what made Israel launch its ground incursion so quickly? That's really a question. Was Hezbollah not ready, and he did not want to give Hezbollah time to prepare, and it was better to go, despite the fact that they had not destroyed part of Hezbollah's defense, and launch this ground operation, which is still very limited. But, well, there will be hundreds of civilian deaths who are in the middle of this. We must not deny it. Either they wanted to outpace them, that might also be the second option, because the openly admitted goal of Israel today is their wish to defeat Hezbollah and to ensure that, in the same way as Hamas exists, but it is no longer a military threat to Israel, with all the war crimes that have taken place on the part of Israel in the Gaza Strip. I won't go back over these points again, but in the same way that Hamas is no longer a threat to Israel, they want to ensure that Hezbollah is no longer a threat to Israel. The death of the Hezbollah leader, we can hope that it has the same effect as the disappearance of bin Laden. Al-Qaeda still exists. Maybe there are guys on the right and left, but as there is no longer a leader, as there is no longer coordination, as there is no longer money, finally, we can hope that it collapses. I see that there are a lot of questions, I'm sorry. I'll come back to them later. And I'm doing the chronological history where we were talking about the missiles exactly and what is happening right now. So Hezbollah, in the face of all this, started to launch salvos of missiles in response, with hundreds and hundreds of missiles being launched, rockets. And as these are relatively low intensity rockets, we know that there is an absolutely gigantic interception rate of the order of 95 up to 100% in some cases, knowing that part of what gets through, they let it through. That's when it falls in the Tegel Desert, right and left. These are quite classic operations today. You are familiar with Iron Dome, which is the low-layer, low-intensity system, with missiles that even cost more than 20,000 euros today. So it's very, very cheap on Israel's part. And this desire to develop laser interceptors, which is called Iron Beam, which has been developed for years, which does not simply intercept missiles and drones, obviously. It's a C random access memory capable of countering rockets, artillery, and mortars. It's so hot, this laser is so effective that it can target a shell in the sky and make it explode with heat. So there is no country in the world today that has something as efficient. And this week, the United States decided to provide an additional $8 billion in aid, a large portion of which will be allocated to improving Israeli air defense, including a new airborne laser system. And here I refer you to, you may remember at the time, there was a Boeing 747 in which the Americans during George Bush's time wanted to put a sort of pencil, a big laser beam on the nose, to be able to detect and intercept ballistic missiles that would have been fired, notably by Iran. Well, apparently the United States is funding Israel so that they can develop an equivalent system which will be available maybe in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But that will mean that the Iranian missiles that Iran spends fortunes to develop, today, a laser beam, it's $2. And then a laser beam, it costs absolutely nothing. So in the end, the defense, there will be an advantage to the defense over the attacker, which is not the case today, obviously, because saturating attacks, defense systems today still cost more than offensive systems that are made relatively easily. Then what we come to the stage of the day is that following the undermining of Hezbollah's operational capacity, we still have, whether it's ground incursions or the destruction of operational potential, we have Iran today, which has started a long-range missile offensive campaign again. I remind you that last April, I believe on the night of the 12th to the 13th or the 13th to the 14th, there was a major attack from Iran on Israel. 95% of the missiles were intercepted, including ballistic missiles. That is to say, the missiles that go to high altitude and fall on. These are the most difficult to intercept because these are not with it's not with Iron Dome, it's with the other systems, front of David and Aerotu, that are capable of intercepting ballistic missiles at several hundred kilometers, not distance, but altitude. Because ballistic missiles, they go very high, they almost go into the stratosphere, and they come down in a relatively symmetrical way. So we know as soon as we've detected where it's coming from with the radar, we're almost certain to know where it's going to land when it arrives. That was intercepted by Israel when it came towards them, but it was intercepted by countries like Saudi Arabia, like Jordan, like the English, the French, the Americans who are present in the area, who are still fighting against the Islamic State. So there was a first shield that intercepted some of these Iranian missiles, and the second part was still intercepted directly by Israel. But the attack that happened today was apparently more massive and more qualitative, meaning there were even fewer low-altitude kamikaze drones that will all be intercepted, notably by F-16s, etc. But there were even more ballistic missiles, which are harder to intercept. And the question is, what is the saturation level? There were 2 salvos. I don't know what's happening right now, but there were 2 salvos of missiles fired by Iran that caused roughly 2 half-hour alerts on Israel, with millions of people being put in shelters. Is this the maximum that Iran is capable of doing tonight? Are they going to do more? Is this a retaliation, a desire for revenge on their part? To avenge Nasrallah? Objectively, if Iran stops there, it may be because they can't do better. Let's be clear. Iran doesn't have efficient fighter jets, still using F-14S, the last country to do so. They lack operational ground capacity, and there's 621 miles between Iran and Israel. Countries between the two that don't necessarily want to see Iran show up, or even an open war in this area. So can't Iran do more? Part of this. Will there be other waves of salvo if they don't want to do more? Or will there be other waves of missile salvo coming in the night? Because you have to know that what is complicated with cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, is that you basically have 2 types of propulsion. Either you have missiles with liquid fuel. It's the easiest to make, it's the easiest to implement, and it's what has existed for decades and decades. The disadvantage is that it requires a very heavy infrastructure around it, because you have to put in hydrogen, cool it down, etc. And for several hours, the tanks need to be filled. And it takes so long to fill up, and it's so easily detectable that it can even be seen by satellite, meaning that satellites see abnormally cooled areas. And so it gives your target time to come and strike the missile that is being prepared to be fired. And most of the Iranian missiles have this technology. And so from the moment they have fired maybe 200 missiles, if that's the total of the silos they have at that time, it takes hours each time to prepare the next salvo, which potentially gives Israel time to go on site to track the future salvos that could arrive. The other technology that is more efficient, more difficult to implement, is with solid fuel. And so this is basically powder. This is what the United States, for example, have developed, the missiles called Minuteman, the Minuteman, because it's the missile that can take off in a minute. From the moment you press the button, as it's solid fuel, it will be able to take off very quickly. And there, Israel today, well, all countries have them, but Iran, apparently, their mobile systems are not powder-based. That is to say, their mobile systems, the fixed silos, we know where they are. We can bomb them relatively easily, or follow them relatively easily with, again, satellites, for example, or drones, or many other things that will be in the region. However, the mobile systems, whose location we do not know for now at least, are liquid systems and therefore easy to detect. I noticed that you've asked me several questions about my mention of Saudi Arabia, because in fact, you have to keep in mind that Israel is not appreciated in the region by quite a few countries. They don't like it, but most of the countries today are at peace with Israel. They don't have a problem with Israel, but they are ultra happy when Israel does the job. The Houthi terrorist group, which is currently preventing countries from living normally, which is preventing Saudi Arabia from exporting its oil, which is preventing the supply of countries in the area, from Bab el-Mandeb, etc., who are directly attacking Egypt on state funding. The passage of the Strait of Gibraltar, it's the 3rd post of the Suez Canal, it's the 3rd source of funding for the Egyptian state. Bahrain participated in operations against the Houthis. So you have all the Sunni countries in the region that are opposed to the Houthis, who are supported by Iran. The Houthis have organized bombings and attacks against the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So if ever Israel, us, the English, the Americans, etc., we go there and we prevent the Houthis from being a threat to these countries, they will bless us. Hamas is the sworn enemy of Egypt and all the countries around through its branch of, I forgot their name, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt and all the other countries around, Jordan, etc., where they organize bombings, etc. So when Iran finances Hamas, yes, that's also why the other Arab countries did not act to oppose Israel when they were in the Gaza Strip. It's that already militarily they are not up to par to be able to oppose, but that anyway, Egypt jumps for joy if Hamas today is no longer a threat to them. Hezbollah is an existential threat to the Lebanese state. It's a state within a state. It's an occupying force. You have to know that Lebanon in the past was already occupied by Syria. So we have a country that is used to being under occupation. So why don't the surrounding countries act? But because they are super happy to see Israel do the job that they dare not do, simply because they do not have the capacity, but also because these states are infiltrated by these groups, notably Hezbollah in Lebanon. And you have these oppositions, whether they are Christian or Sunni, who tomorrow are potentially not enemies of Israel in this war against Hezbollah, and who would be quite available for some of them to come and support the fact of getting rid of Hezbollah so that Lebanon can be an independent state. And that is really something important to keep in mind. There is not a unanimous opposition to Israel in the area, quite the contrary. I noticed Moroccans and little Moroccan flags as well, which I saw earlier. A terrorist group like the Polisario Front is also supported by Iran globally. Iran is an enemy of Sunni countries, and the Sunni countries from Morocco to the Maghreb are generally happy that Israel is doing the job today. Even if some do not recognize the presence, the existence of the state of Israel, they are obliged today to recognize that they are doing the job that they cannot do today. The real question now is, will Iran stop there? As I said earlier, it's a possibility, but maybe they're recharging their batteries to withdraw again tonight. And two, will Israel respond? Will Israel attack Iran? Will they conduct military operations against Iran? And there are several options. They clearly conducted operations by flying at very low altitude, as they did with the tools. And then I think that Saudi Arabia, etc., they turned a blind eye when Israel made strikes to go strike all the way to Yemen. Have you seen where it is? It's still really far away. And historically, you should know that there is a freedom of action on Syria. Iraq may be more effective militarily, but Syria, it's open bar. If Israel tomorrow wants to fly over Syria to go to Iran, it's super easy to do. You need to know a story. I already told you about it some time ago on the channel, that Russia betrayed Iran by providing Israel with all the information on Iranian air defense. Let me explain. Do you remember when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008? Georgia was armed notably with Israeli drones. And Russia had a lot of difficulty shooting down these Israeli drones that were relatively simple. They deployed MiG-29s, etc., to try to intercept them. It was really a hassle for the Russians to confront these Israeli drones operated by Georgia. And then there was a double betrayal. Russia proposed to Israel, give me the information to take down the drones operated by Georgia, in exchange for which I will give you information on Iranian air defense. And so there was a Russian betrayal, there was an Israeli betrayal against the Georgians, and there was a Russian betrayal against Iran. And so today, at that time, there were no stealth planes yet, there were no F-35s, etc. With simple F-15S, they were already capable of going up to the border of Iran to conduct military operations and bomb Iranian soil. And today, how does it work? A very long distance air raid. The F-35, if I'm not mistaken, must have a range that must be about 1,553 miles. It will need to be checked. It's approximate what I'm telling you. Between Israel and Iran, there must be about 1,242 miles. There must be 621 miles, so 1,242 miles round trip. Israeli fighter planes We have an F-35. You take off vertically from your country. You climb, you refuel when you are already vertically at 10,000 miles of altitude. That is to say that the Israeli plane will start its mission already in cruise flight, fuel filled. It will be able to make the 621 miles on the way to deliver its armaments, which can be either gliding bombs that can go 43.496 miles away. When we talk about JIDAM-ER, extended range, which have a propulsion at the back, or cruise missiles, which for the shot certainly exceed 186 miles of distance, the question is, today Israel must have 350 fighter planes, more than the French army. For a very small state, they are capable of undermining all the air forces that are around them, knowing incidentally that there are air forces around them that are less efficient, and that there are even agreements that are conducted so that the countries around, even when they buy armaments, they are less good than those that Israel has. For example, when France sold Rafales to Egypt, it sold Rafales, but not the Meteor missile that it has with it. There are Scalp missiles with a 186 miles range, but no Meteor air defense missile, which has the best operational range known as the no escape zone. So even today, we make sure that even countries that recognize the presence of Israel, who are at peace with Israel, like Egypt, cannot pose a threat to Israel. And then since the Abraham Accords, in which the Emirates, etc., also recognize Israel and are at peace with Israel and have diplomatic relations, have official trade relations with this country, obviously you have fewer and fewer countries that are opposed to the presence of Israel. So there is a normalization of relations. All this to tell you that if Israel decides to launch a major air operation on Iran, they can at least use 30-40 F-35 type fighter planes that would conduct air raids, that would go destroy the air defense, that would potentially destroy bunkers, that would go destroy missile launch sites that are going to their homes, or even that could target the famous nuclear facilities. And you have something even bigger here. It's that, yes, Iran has no other ability to defend itself than to fire terrorist missiles to potentially hit Israel. But in addition, you have the United States in the area to prevent Iran from doing so. And if Iran were to launch all its missiles tomorrow, we can be assured that the United States, with their 2 aircraft carriers in the area, with their bases present in the region, they also have the ability to strike and support Israel, to defend Israel and intercept kamikaze drones that would be launched. So here we are in a situation that is really, I won't say explosive, but I don't think that even if Israel were to strike Iran, I don't think Iran has the ability to do much more than what they have already done in the last few hours. Because given the proximity of all the American-Israeli military potential and the laissez-faire of Saudi Arabia and all the others, and the inability of the Syrians to curb this, they simply risk losing all their missile potential and their nuclear program, or even overthrowing the Iranian mullahs. So we know how much they are hated on the spot with the oppositions you may have recently seen. I tried to respond at the same time. The Abraham Accords, indeed, it was Bahrain, Sudan also, who recognized the presence of the Israeli state. And Morocco, obviously, I was only talking about those who were in the area. So Xavier, I'm talking about the classes of people's pressure rising in many Arab countries. Normalization will be challenging after the events in Gaza and Lebanon. Yes, that I completely agree. The Arab street is the main obstacle to the fact, for example, that a country like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, the Houthis can be openly strafed, for instance. The Arab street does not understand that the Houthis, when they shoot at boats passing through the area, it's against Israel, supposedly, but they have bombed boats carrying grain to the countries in the area. And the fact of having, for example, Egypt that could go intervene to prevent the Houthis from acting in the area would be entirely legitimate. But because of the Arab street, indeed, the countries are not free to act. Yes, because public opinion matters. But whatever happens today, the Arab street, it is not unanimous. And once again, when you look at Lebanon, the street, the Arab Christians, the Sunnis from the area are not going to be unhappy if Hezbollah disappears. So you have to see that the situation is very, very different. And I think that the Israeli excesses in the Gaza Strip, which were much too heavy-handed, with military actions that were much too intense, with actions that were questionable on humanitarian grounds, and I'm even talking about access to water, there were quite a few things that happened that were not acceptable, or even the fact that they were so heavy-handed that even when Israeli hostages come out with their hands in the air, they get killed by Israeli soldiers. It's clear that they were not being moderate, but on the other hand, they will not do the same thing with Lebanon. Firstly, because they won't alienate a part of the Lebanese population. And then because they won't attack Lebanon as a state, they will attack Hezbollah. The Gaza Strip is not the same thing. Let's say that the local government, which refused elections and had imposed itself for decades, must be, according to Israel, must be destroyed. In Lebanon, there is no war against a good part of the civilian population. There is no war against the Lebanese government. And if the Lebanese government tomorrow takes advantage of the situation to remove Hezbollah from the country, it will also be beneficial for Lebanon against corruption, against this mafia state that infiltrates via Hezbollah. So yes, the Arab street is not united, but nevertheless, it must be understood that there is a part of the Arab street today that will be satisfied not with the actions of Israel, but who will be satisfied with the consequences of a possible Israeli action. And Lebanon, in any case, is a country today that is in great, great difficulty for many good reasons. Do the Iranians have the KR-313 Valentine? So that's the fighter jet that the Iranians presented a few years ago. But it was the ultimate joke, since obviously the KR-313 was a plane they just presented in a hangar. I'll refer you to a video I made on this particular subject, the lie through the image, in which I posted. It's been over 3 years since I made this video. I think it's one of the first videos I made that exceeded 1 million views, in which I was explaining the Iranian bullshit that pretended to develop a local fighter jet. The fighter jet, it didn't look like a fighter jet at all. It couldn't fly. The air intakes were all small and triangular. It's like saying a child's toy. In fact, the pilot, he exceeded all that. So it couldn't be stealthy. It couldn't even be aerodynamic. And so to prove that it was indeed a fighter jet, they had made a crappy montage in which the Iranians had taken the model they had presented, which was a scale model. At scale 1, supposedly it was the real plane, and they had made a copy-paste with an Iranian mountain behind, except that we had seen the copy-paste. It was super badly done. And so afterwards, they had made and flown a reduced model saying, in Sicily, look at the thing. It is operational, so Iran does not have a KR-313. They do not have the technologies. However, the rise in Iranian skills, it will be possible a priori with the arrival of the Sukhoi 35 ordered by Egypt. Egypt has given up buying Sukhoi 35s from the moment when... I'm going back. Egypt had ordered Sukhoi 35s a few years ago. The Sukhoi 35 is a multi-mission aircraft, except that they had bought Sukhoi 35s with standard North Atlantic Treaty Organization equipment in the same way that Algeria bought Sukhoi 34s with designation pods that are a derivative of the French Damocles pod with French Thales and Safran avionics present on board Russian Sukhoi fighter planes for decades. And so Russia was producing Sukhois with this equipment. From the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Russia no longer had the right to have this equipment in its own planes, but it could still export it. And so they were selling, for example, to Indonesia. They offered a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, standard Sukhoi 35, with North Atlantic Treaty Organization equipment, and it's the same for Egypt. And when, after the invasion of 2022, they finally no longer had the right to access, not even to sell to someone else, these pieces of equipment that are of better quality than what Russia is capable of making, and you have both Indonesia and Egypt who have cancelled the contracts that had already been signed with Russia, and instead they bought Rafale. We're not going to complain about it, but that means you have one of the Sukhoi 35s that had already been built for Egypt, but who gave up its planes. And presumably Russia is going to give its Sukhoi 35s to Iran in payment for the kamikaze drones and ballistic missiles that are supplied by Iran to Russia. It's an exchange, a barter, but for a hunting one, in exchange for ballistic missiles. And according to American sources, the Iranians regret today having given several hundred ballistic missiles to Russia because they would miss them today in the context of a major offensive. So the potential for Iranian escalation today is solely linked to Russia's ability and willingness to deliver Sukhoi 35s, which Russia itself lacks since it has lost more than 100 fighter jets in Ukraine. So there are still some real questions. Will they keep their word? Will they give them? Will Iran be able to integrate them? And what are Russian Sukhoi 35s worth without the slightly better equipment that was provided by France? In my opinion, not much against countries like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates that are opposite. It will nevertheless not be a threat because these are previous generation radars, what we call passive antenna electronic scanning radars, while all the planes in the world are active antennas. So yes, these are very good passive antenna radars. But any Chinese fighter has active antenna radars, the active Rafale, the Eurofighter, any plane for several years now have radars. The Russian radars are totally outdated, including on the Sukhoi 35. I'm going back to the questions. No, I'm not going to talk about Ukraine today, but know that all the buddies are doing well. Frank is also doing well. The right to self-defense corresponds to a notion of proportionality. So I'm not a lawyer, but self-defense, if we look at it from the Israeli point of view, there is the fact that ammunition stocks or bunkers are positioned on the schools. Unfortunately, there will be collateral damage. And so self-defense, which prevents bombings and thousands of missiles falling on the state of Israel, of course, they would prefer to cause 30 deaths in Lebanon than to have even one death at home. We must be clear that there is no doubt on Israel's side. They want to prevent new missiles from falling on them, and so they will act accordingly to prevent the arrival of these missiles, and including by making mistakes and having hundreds of deaths on Lebanese territory. And incidentally, as it is very confessional, again, Lebanon, it is really in the pro-Hezbollah areas that the Hezbollah installations are located, because if they had been to mess in the Christian neighborhood or in the Sunni neighborhood, it would have already been identified and destroyed, even voluntarily, by the locals. So it's less painful to accept for the other communities when the mistakes are made within the allies of Hezbollah. Again, Sukhoi, so there are pro-Russian Africans in the chat. Hello, I don't believe Africans are pro-Russian, as there is more immigration to Europe than to Russia. Until then, I think it's all bullshit. There is no concept of proportionality. So listen, there are legal debates in there. Come on, people should work for peace and not for war. All you have to do is ask Russia to stop bombing Ukraine, and all you have to do is ask Iran to stop bombing Israel. I think indeed we will go in the right direction, because once again, all of this, and even in the Gaza Strip, everything stops tomorrow if Hamas returns the 100 Israeli hostages they still have. And that's clear. They refuse to return the 100 hostages. Israel, listen, we are at peace tomorrow, and we'll stop the bombings then. All the nightmare we are living today in the Gaza Strip, it could have stopped today, right now there. If we ask for it, if they agree to release the hostages, it's over. So I'm okay with Israel taking military actions that we can consider as the situation is disproportionate, but if Hamas had not attacked and returned the hostages within days, we would not be in this situation at all. We would be at peace, and we would have peoples living in peace side by side. And the problem is that when Hamas overflows into Jordan, Egypt, etc., inevitably they make enemies. And that's why there's no compassion in the area. Yes, the Arab Street, there is compassion in the population. And that's why the local rulers know very well that it's to their advantage too, what I was saying earlier, that the state of Israel manages to finish this job. However, let's be clear once again, I am against Israeli imperialism, which consists of colonization. The Golan Heights are occupied, they are not annexed, they are not recognized as part of the state of Israel. I am for an independent, sovereign, autonomous Palestinian state in which people would work, pay taxes, no longer be considered as refugees, to have their democratically elected government, in which they would have functional institutions, in which they could work, in which they could travel from the moment they are. It must be understood that on this issue, the French diplomatic position is the best in the world. We are balanced between the two. We do not recognize We do not recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights by Israel. We do not recognize. We are against the settlements, and we are for having a Palestinian state there. I really think that this is the best position we can have. The two states must coexist side by side. The problem being that Islamist extremists consider that Israel must disappear and that they will never sign an agreement in which Israel exists, so they have no interest in signing. And on the other hand, you have Jewish extremists who do not want a state, since this area must historically return to Israel for biblical reasons. Two incompatible visions of the situation exist, necessitating a political decision to achieve peace, which will ultimately come from politics. In fact, war is the continuation of politics by other means. You know the famous phrase of Clausewitz. But very clearly, if you have all the countries agreeing to mess up Iranian militias from Morocco to Iraq, I think we can live more peacefully. The area will be more peaceful for years. Iran, Palestine, and Lebanon have the right to defend themselves, but Lebanon is rather that we must not confuse Hezbollah and Lebanon. PM billionaire Lebanon does not want Hezbollah. A majority of the population would not want to have Hezbollah, would not want to have a terrorist group that uses Lebanon to attack Israel, which would avoid having behind Israel, which is forced to defend itself. You cannot consider that bombing Israel is an acceptable situation, and therefore you have a majority of Lebanese who would like Hezbollah to disappear and who would simply like to live in peace and not have a terrorist group, an army made up of terrorist groups operating from their territory. We must not confuse, once again, Palestine, the right to defend itself. Once again, I support a Palestinian state and believe Israel is mistaken in not accepting one. Come on, friends, do you have any other questions? Otherwise, will the Russians deliver Iranian missiles to the Iranians afterwards? I believe we are still considering our options. No, in principle, we're going to stop. Russia is having too much trouble securing the Ukrainian front, so they're buying everything they can buy. It was Vias. And yes, that's also true. The wear and tear of Iran's missile stocks is indeed favorable to the Ukrainians. It will save them from delivering to the Russians. And that it's true that there is a side effect. It's that everything that is fired by Iran at Israel and which is intercepted at almost 100% by Israel, it's that much less that the Iranians can provide to the Russians, because the advantage of the Israelis is that their air defense, it's a small territory, ultra well defended, ultra technological, with lots of air defenses everywhere, which is not at all the case of Ukraine. So logically, it's better from a Ukrainian point of view that Iran wastes its ammunition on Israel so that everything is intercepted, rather than they arrive in Russia, where they will be fired and there will be 5-8% that will hit maternity wards, schools, etc. I quite agree with that. Won't that be very favorable to Ukraine? So we must not forget that countries like Cyprus, for example, had planned to provide their T-80 tank to Ukraine in exchange for the recovery of Israeli Merkava tanks. In essence, there was a game of musical chairs today. Merkava tanks were sent to Cyprus, while tanks from Cyprus were sent to Ukraine. And the problem is that the offensives of Hamas in particular have made Israel give up getting rid of its tanks in favor of Cyprus. So I don't know if it's profitable for Ukraine, but in my opinion, probably not. While there will be fewer missiles arriving in Russia due to the reason mentioned, some countries will choose to keep their ammunition instead of supplying it to Ukraine. This is the case with France, which intercepts missiles, tools. This is the case when we are present on Iranian missiles, will also be intercepted. So we are wasting local air defense to defend Israel because we are present in the area as well, rather than being able to supply them to Ukraine. There is a part of the aid that was intended for Ukraine that was diverted for the benefit of Israel, because the United States will always favor Israel, just as they have defense agreements with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Israel, with a whole bunch of countries. They will respect their agreements with these countries, and they do not properly respect the agreements that were signed with Ukraine. And notably, I remind you of the same Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear bombs in exchange for a guarantee of the security of its borders, a guarantee provided by the United States, China, Great Britain, Russia, and France, obviously, which has a separate annex, but the result is the same. We are supposed to guarantee the security of Ukrainian borders, and we did not do it. But overall, I'm not sure that the world's conflagration is favorable to Ukraine. In the same way, when Iran bombed Pakistani Balochistan by launching ballistic missiles directly at Pakistan, the consequence is that Pakistan, which was supposed to supply its T-80 tanks to Ukraine, did not do it. When South Korea began supplying millions of shells to the United States so that the United States could give their millions of shells to Ukraine, what did North Korea do? North Korea began firing at South Korea. What happened when Japan began supplying Patriot air defense missiles, sent some back to the United States so that the United States could supply their own? It's always the same thing. Musical chairs, Japanese law prohibits supplying arms to a country at war. So they can't do it. So they were supplying the arms to the United States so that the United States could give them. And what happened when Japan started doing that? Well, you have North Korea launching missiles that passed over the Sea of Japan. So overall, the more chaotic the world becomes, the fewer weapons will be available for Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. Overall, I'm not in favor of the world being in chaos, but when we look at it from two Ukrainian perspectives, it's not necessarily positive either. If it's not for an ideological dimension, which is not really applied today, it's necessary to keep in mind the understanding that at the origin of all this, it's the axis Russia, Iran, North Korea. And if Ukraine can win this war against Russia, it's also the abandonment of a global method in which it's the balance of power that counts, whether it's Azerbaijan with Armenia, whether it's Guyana with Venezuela, whether it's so in Burma, there are many countries in which the province of Bakassi in Cameroon, you have plenty of water in which, if we return to the balance of power, it's not a good thing. And so the Ukrainian victory and the Russian inability to achieve the results it wants to achieve in Ukraine, that's also something that would be favorable. But this global understanding that we need to extinguish the global fire by preventing Russia from being a nuisance and by preventing it from winning in Ukraine, I think that's not yet acquired by everyone, and then we don't allow ourselves to properly arm Ukraine as it should be done, even if it's just allowing them to use the weapons we provide them in good conditions. Go ahead, friends. Do I think that Israel will react directly on Iranian soil following today's attacks? Is this what if the Israelis have proof that Iran is preparing a third salvo of missiles by filling their missiles with liquid fuels that can be detected from satellites? I am convinced that Israel will at least strike the sites from which the missiles will be fired. Will this be an open door to smash storage sites, production sites of this fuel? Will they go further by hitting headquarters, political leaders, or the nuclear program? That's still another step, but tonight I'm convinced that if Iran is preparing a new home court, Israel will go and prevent them from making this additional home court, because obviously it's better to intercept them before they leave, rather than trying to intercept them when they are in flight, even though David's Sling and Arrow 2 are excellent ballistic air defense systems. Let's be clear, it's not 100% foolproof as it can be for cross-layer missiles with the Iron Dome system. I'm starting to get tired. All right, one last question. What's the I in F-35I? Is it for Israel? Yes, because for David, indeed, Israel is the only country that has been allowed to modify the F-35s by integrating their own avionics. I think their own helmet as well. So it's a dedicated version, specially made for them. And apparently they are working to have what we call conformal tanks. On top of the fuselage, we add a form of additional tank that allows to further increase the range. And once again, I tell you from memory, the F-35, it has 1,553 miles of autonomy. But as they do not make a straight line, it's normal to have zigzags because we bypass electronic warfare sites or radars when we want to go strike on Iran.
And so in this context, it can be interesting to have additional tanks on top. But the Israeli F-35, that's why it's the F-35IC.
It's a dedicated version, different from the one used by all other countries in the world that have the A, the B, and the C, with very small variations, an extra parachute, stuff like that. But it's very, very limited. And Israel is the only one really that has a specific variant. And then for all the Iranian missiles, I don't know them all by heart, but there is the Fateh, there is the Shahab, and you have to know that Iran also has the ability to even hit France with missiles, like the Cat-4, which have a range sufficient to hit all of France except Brittany. I hope you live in Brittany anyway. You have to be aware that Israel finally, that Iran is also a global threat with this vision that they want to hit well beyond the ranks, and its strike capacity is well beyond the ranks. And I see a question on whether Israel is strong in avionics. Israel is one of the champions in avionics against Thalis, in anti-aircraft missiles, in cruise missiles, in onboard avionics. They are super strong. Israel has their local fighter plane, the CAFIR. They haven't made other versions, but they excel at making improvements to the United States fighter planes they purchase. They are sovereign, they are autonomous in many, many areas. In air defense, they are super strong. It's an ultra-technological state, and they also have the support of the United States. There is $1 billion in military means in technology transfer and in joint development of technologies, and it's not a specificity of Israel. For example, the Egyptian army receives billions of dollars each year from the United States for its operation, for the purchase of equipment, for the fight against terrorism. So supporting countries militarily is still a constant on the part of the United States towards its allies. In the region, it's obviously something that continues. Come on, guys. Thanks, Gaetan. I saw that you did some moderation. Sorry for all those who have questions. Isn't it the only state capable of modifying the F-35 NOAA US engineering behind? It's quite possible that the Israelis are the only ones who have, their country also have their electronic warfare library, which are not the same. Why is Israel not more Ukraine then? Because then I'm just going to answer this question from Stelius. Go check out Stelius' channel, it's awesome. Israel has a significant Russian-speaking population, which is not necessarily, even if they understand the issues well, which is not necessarily in favor of direct support to Ukraine. Nevertheless, given the evidence of Russian-Iranian involvement in favor of Hamas, there is a part of public opinion that has shifted relatively recently, and there are advanced discussions for the provision of equipment. So there are already detection radars that are used by Ukraine. There are Israeli cameras called the Raptor camera, for example, which is integrated on drones like the Gore from Airlogics. So there are Israeli components that are already openly sold to Ukraine, which was not the case in the past, but also the question of supplying Ukraine with missiles from the Patriot air defense systems that were supposed to be replaced. It was planned that they would be phased out. Now they could be replaced by the David's sling and arrow systems, which are two systems that are developed locally that cost less and are with their own engineering, and they do not need to ask the United States to be able to use them as they want. It is also a question of sovereignty for the Israelis to develop these systems. So presumably there are Israeli Patriot systems that will be available, which could be supplied to Ukraine. But again, when we see the intensity of the attacks that we can see with Iran, it would not be surprising if Israel finally keeps its Patriot batteries and has them in accumulation. And maybe in 6 months, in a year when it will be calmer, maybe it could get rid of them. But it will certainly, if the plan to provide Patriots to Ukraine was planned, for example, in the coming weeks, I think that they will not do it now. Good evening, friends. I have work to do. I am going to work now for real, and I also invite you to see the last video that I made yesterday, which is published on the situation in Ukraine. Thank you to all those who were present tonight, and then I will see you very soon. Hello, everyone. Thank you all. See you soon. Thank you for always being at Cienbro. You are 4,000 miles and all the good lines because we stop and do sports. Take care of yourself. My decoration, at a point on the decoration, I tidied up my office, the pretty ones, that's pieces of plane, that's a piece of Sukhoi 34 of a month. That's all the helicopters, pieces of the L8 and 1024 4P. Finally, Russian Mi-24 Kamov 52 over there. Those are the three variants of the Sukhoi 34. Here you have the Sukhoi 24, Sukhoi 25, Sukhoi 30, Sukhoi 35, and there you go. The collection contains pieces of downed Russian planes. I also have pieces of tanks. That's the thing, because actually, when I bring equipment to Ukraine, people give me gifts. There you go, there you go. Typically, Xavier, to thank you, we offer you a piece of Sukhoi 34. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? So I have lots of pieces of downed Russian agents in my office. And this, of course, is the most beautiful one. Sukhoi 34, we have the reference and location of where it was shot down. There you go. That's cool. One last one before we wrap up. That one. As long as we're at it, as long as you're still 3,000, I have one last thing to show you. I'm very proud of this. I haven't shown it yet, but I made a little video, my friends. I have officially received a Ukrainian decoration for all the efforts we've made, thanks to you, with your support. You've seen, thanks to you, I am now officially decorated by the Ukrainian government. I am very proud of this and I owe it to you. So I should make a little video because it's Flash who gave me this decoration. So I thank you because it's also thanks to you. What is this? I have too much powder behind me if I went all around my desk. Thank you. I'll see you soon. Good night. I'm going to have some tea now because my throat hurts and I'm feeling really bad. Good evening and thank you all. Good night.